So far it's been a really great and informative event, and last but not least is the final panel of the night, dealing with the institutional constraints on investigations of police-involved shootings. So tonight you've heard the history of why this has happened, and we've heard scholars talk about what the statistics look like and what some of the issues are. And now for this panel, we're going to hold some of our leaders to account and ask them questions about this particular issue and how do we move forward. So I'd like to introduce first Brian Abernathy, who is the first Deputy Managing Director for the City of Philadelphia, and he was appointed in January 2016. And in his role, he oversees the operating departments and the day-to-day functions, focusing specifically on public safety. Next, we have our newly elected District Attorney, Larry Krasner, and everybody knows. And if you don't, sorry. And next, we have our new Executive Director for the Police Advisory Commission, Hans Menos, and you came in October, right?
That's correct.
And he's new to Philadelphia, but throughout his career, he's worked with a variety of vulnerable populations, including marginalized youth, recent immigrants, and victims of domestic violence. So I'm really happy to have all of you gentlemen here tonight, and let's get started. Many people don't know what process needs to occur once there's been a police-involved shooting. Can you please describe the steps needed for an effective investigation and describe the roles that your offices play in the investigation of police-involved shootings? Brian?
Sure. Actually, just to, Professor Gottschalk actually said something in the first panel about changing the conversation around police-involved shootings. And so I do want to provide quick context. In 2007, there were 62 officer-involved shootings in Philadelphia. In 2012, there were 59. In 2016, there were 24, and last year there were 14. That is not by accident. That has been very deliberate, and has been a partnership with the Department of Justice, where they came in, we had 92 recommendations. We had, 91 recommendations. We've implemented 85. The ones we haven't implemented, largely because of FOP contracts. Commissioner Ross takes this issue very seriously, and has been very deliberate in how he has tried to turn the department and to provide greater social justice to our disadvantaged neighborhoods. An investigation of an officer-involved shooting, and I can speak to kind of what the rules of the road are for the police department. Much of what Professor Gottschalk actually talked about are captured within our policies. But when an officer fires his weapon, that officer is immediately to report that to police radio, and the officer that's on the scene is also to report that to police radio. Police radio then notifies the internal affairs, the officer-involved shooting investigation team, which I'll talk about in a moment, investigative support, so that's criminal crime scene, the crime scene unit, the real-time crime center, etc., the police advisory commission, executive director, and the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office and the police advisory commission is invited to the scene, and the DA has to sign off on search warrants, so we try to involve the district attorney as early as possible. That discharging officer has the ability to provide a statement on the scene. Oftentimes they invoke the right to counsel or invoke the right to a union representative. IAB does make every effort to interview that officer within 72 hours. The PAC is briefed on the shooting at the scene, but is not allowed on the scene to preserve the investigation. The shooting review team is a separate investigatory unit within the police department. So IAB does investigate the shooting. They investigate it for administrative failures. So they investigate it to make sure that the officer actually followed police procedure. The officer-involved shooting team investigates it for criminal conduct. There is a solid wall between IAB and OIF and the officer-involved shooting team. That wall is there to preserve both investigations. The one major difference between the investigations is that IAB, because it is an employer investigation, can compel the testimony of a witness. that testimony cannot be provided to the prosecution. Again, to protect the officer's Fifth Amendment rights. The shooting team refers it to the district attorney for criminal charges. On the other side, on the administrative side, IAB continues that investigation. There's a use of force board, which the Police Advisory Commission sits on. That board reviews the evidence and makes a recommendation to the Police Board of Inquiry, or at times the commissioner can make the decision himself without a board of inquiry. I think, generally speaking, what I think we've seen in the last year, Commissioner Ross has taken the evidence that's been presented at these cases very seriously. He's very deliberate. I think the one criticism I've heard of the commissioner is that folks feel like he should move faster. He doesn't, because he wants to make sure he gets it right. And I think in these cases specifically, getting it right is vital. And I think to date, I think he's done a nice job of making sure he gets things right. That's not to say that the police department is perfect, but we are looking forward to the district attorney's partnership as we go forward. This is a partnership to make sure that we do this right. And we don't want cops on the street that shoot folks. I want to make that very clear. The commissioner doesn't want it, I don't want it, the mayor certainly doesn't want it. Bad cops need to be taken off the street. And if we're going to do everything we can to do that. That's not to say that every shooting is a bad shooting. We want to make sure that we differentiate those and understand them and investigate them fully.
Thank you, Brian. DA Krasner, is he correct? Now, I know you've only had the job as DA for a few days since you've been sworn in, but you ran on a platform of reform, and you ran on being a civil rights person, and you may not remember, we were actually on a TV show together 4 years ago as pundits. And you were talking about, we had a very spirited discussion, which I love. You just don't remember. From your standpoint, using sort of your prior experience, not to say that Mr. Abernathy is not correct, but from your standpoint, is he accurate in terms of these police shootings, and how do you plan on dealing with this issue in your district attorney's office?
First of all, I do remember that. I suffered a severe beatdown in that town. I still have not gotten over it. Mr. Abernathy is definitely correct about the procedures involved, and I do not disagree with him that I think Commissioner Ross, much like his predecessor, would like to operate a system where there is justice in officer-involved shootings. I can tell you that I don't have exactly the same statistics as Brian does. I have a different statistic that's related, which is the number of total police shootings investigated over the last 7 years. And you should understand these numbers are probably different simply because of a few definitional things. These shootings, for example, include non-fatal, fatal, accidental, animal, and law enforcement may be defined to include all agencies rather than just Philadelphia Police Department. But I will say this, I can confirm that at least the number of cases that have been investigated, and under current policies, all cases are supposed to be investigated, has declined. Since 2010, we are showing 92 investigations, and by 2017, we are showing 37. So it may be that something good is going on in terms of the trigger not being pulled, and that's an important thing. If we move to the issue of the quality of these investigations, I think this is actually an issue of national significance. It really is. Because if you compare the procedures that are followed in a law enforcement involved shooting and in a shooting allegedly perpetrated by anybody else, they represent two completely different pathways. And they create a public perception that is not wrong, that there is favoritism and unfairness in the investigation of officer-involved shootings. The reality is that if there are two people outside of a bar and a gun is fired and the police show up, there is not going to be an immediate notification of a lawyer, which does happen if you are an officer. there is not going to be the officer being whisked away to internal affairs, probably before a shooting team shows up. And there is not going to be this scenario in which a statement is required, but that statement can never be used in court and never turned over. It is almost a perfect situation for law enforcement who've been involved in a shooting as compared to an average civilian who would be immediately interrogated. No attorney would be called. There would be no whisking away. And oh, trust me, anything that came out of that individual's mouth would be used. So those pathways look different because they are different. And the situation is, of course, intensified because when an investigation is done of a civilian by police, there is not the same sense of camaraderie, loyalty, mutual obligation, brotherhood, whatever you may call it, as there is when you have police officers investigating people who are often members of the same department, all right? I mean, let's get real about this. Every member of the Philadelphia Police is a member of the Fraternal Order of Police. Nothing wrong with that. That's just the truth. The attorney who's going to show up to represent the law enforcement officer who is being investigated is an attorney for the Fraternal Order of Police. The officer-involved shooting team of the Philadelphia Police Department is comprised of Philadelphia police officers who are members of the Fraternal Order of Police. That is the reality. There have been some improvements in recent years. This officer-involved shooting team is now housed separately in Philadelphia from where it used to be. It's up at, I believe, 20th and Wolf, 24th and Wolf. And it does include experienced investigators, but I just went through a list of them as I was discussing this with people in my new office. And lo and behold, who do we find but a detective I know very well and like, who is actually a high-level official in the Fraternal Order of Police. Well, ain't that something? So, my understanding is that there have been efforts in the past to try to bring in outside investigators. In other words, to try to bring in people who are not Philadelphia police officers currently, not recent ex-Philadelphia police officers, and the response of the Fraternal Order of Police is that that is a violation of the city contract because you're bringing in people who should be under this union contract to do the same duties. And this city solicitor's office has advised the DA's office, oh, we can't do that. We just can't do that. We can't bring in people from the outside. So what do you think you get? Who here knows when is the last time there was a prosecution of an on-duty Philadelphia police officer for a shooting? Does anybody know?
15 years.
I'm sorry?
1999.
That sounds about right. 1999. So if we look just at this list of fatal shootings since 2010, 50, since 2010. The good news is that no Philadelphia police officer ever committed a crime in all of those 50 shootings. That's the good news. Would you like to know the batting average for people who are not Philadelphia police officers when they are investigated for shootings? I suggest to you it's a lot lower than that batting average. Look, we came here to tell the truth. Let's tell the truth. This ain't fair. This is biased. That is how it has been for the 30 years that I have been working as a criminal defense lawyer and a civil rights lawyer. I don't doubt for 1 second that this commissioner wants it to be better. I thoroughly believe that. But until there is a political will to fight back against this, to have a contract that doesn't create this incestuous, conflicted situation where the entire thing is treated differently than a normal shooting, and the FOP at multiple levels has control over it, you ain't gonna have justice. And you're not gonna have justice in a way that is going to continue to divide society fundamentally, and it's also going to continue to leave civilians in a position where they feel alienated from police in their neighborhoods, and they, therefore, will work with police to give them information, to solve homicides, to solve shootings, because they look at this situation and they think that their interaction with the government in regard to these cases is completely unfair. Okay? So what can be done? Well, I mean, to be honest, I haven't been in office all that long, so this is a work in progress. But there is some good news, and let me give it to you. Philly juries are great juries. They are not good juries. They are great juries. They are the best juries I've ever seen. That's not to say that they are pro-criminal defense or they're pro-civil rights necessarily, but it is to say this. Look at the fact that personal injury lawyers come from all over the country to try their cases in Philadelphia when they could pick from many jurisdictions. They come here. And they come here in part because their clients are generally working class people. They're looking for juries who will identify with working class people rather than owners of large corporations, rather than government. And so they spend a lot of money flying around, staying in hotels so they can do it here. Look at this fact. It is a fact that when you pick a jury in a homicide case in Philly, I've picked many of them, you will see a remarkable number of jurors who will tell you all three of the following. I have a relative who's a police officer, I have a relative who's doing hard time, and either I or someone else has been murdered in my family or has been a victim of a serious crime. So these are people who live in an urban environment with regular interaction or at least observation of police activity and have a very fair and three-dimensional view of what they're up against. I can't really think of a better group of people to hear these cases, which might be exactly why DAs for 30 years have not brought these cases in state court. The only way these cases have been brought, and I shouldn't say the only way, but there are so few examples of these cases being brought to state court because some of my predecessors didn't like the politics around that. And therefore it fell to the federal authorities here, who sometimes did bring cases, and those juries are terrible. Those juries are 90%, by the time they're picked, with the way you can challenge a juror, they are 90% white. They are about 80 to 90% outside of Philadelphia. They're overwhelmingly Republican. These are jurors who, in cases I've actually had, have been afraid to leave the federal courthouse for fear of a drive-by shooting at 6th and Market. And I'm not making that up. The walk to Chinatown is treacherous. Put on your Kevlar. Those people are not convicted law enforcement officers for anything. I've also tried civil rights cases down there. We did a lot better than most people, but boy, you better come in there with a client who is either clergy or military or has a PhD if you want to have any shot at convincing a federal jury that there has even been a civil rights violation worthy of paying $1. So I don't have all the answers here by any means, but I got one answer for you. If we have the facts and we have the law, if we follow the evidence instead of following anybody's politics, and we have a case in Philadelphia County, we are bringing a case in Philadelphia County. And no, we will not necessarily win. These cases have been lost all over the country time and time again in a way that frankly just puts more salt in the wound. But I'm not so sure we're going to lose all these cases in Philadelphia County. These juries are pretty fair. I'm not sure that answered your question, but.
That was great. So Hans, last but not least, why don't you tell us a little bit about I know you're new to the job, but can you tell us a little bit about the role that the Police Advisory Commission plays and some of the difficulties you have, like the role you play, but some of the difficulties that you see in the system and what you're hoping to do in your new capacity to make the PAC more effective?
Yeah, definitely. So first, thank you for having me, and thank you for the organizers. And a suggestion, if I can, for maybe you can put Larry last next time. Really unfortunate for me, but I'll do my best. So, I think it's important to kind of contextualize the PAC with both Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission and other major cities and how they operate their oversight. Philadelphia is not all that unique in that in our challenges and what the PAC is facing. It's unique in many ways. I know Philadelphians don't like to hear that the city is not unique, so I'm not suggesting that. Just the challenge that we face in that unique. And those challenges can often be just access to information. What that means to get information from the police department will often hold that information. I think that in my time working in New York and also working here, We have police departments, and I think police around the country that firmly believe that they are under attack. They believe that there's no one who can understand how difficult their jobs are, and believe that that questions, inquisitive questions, critiques are inherently negative. And that there's a media desire to take them down. That is, if there's anything consistent around the country of what I've discovered from police departments, it's that general feeling that they are up against the wall and that there's no one, that they have no allies. So that is, that is a challenge that for me, first and foremost, that I really need to get over. I need to help and do my very best to try and explain to all police officers, whether they're frontline officer up to police leadership, that the goal of the PAC and other police advisory commissions is to help, is to identify problems, that we can be useful as civilians, we can be useful in our point of view on things, we can be useful in the way that we conceptualize issues, and that we can highlight some of the issues that Mr. Krasner referenced in the idea of procedural justice and legitimacy that is lost when special exceptions are offered to officers. In special exceptions, I do mean the things that Mr. Krasner referenced, when they get an attorney at the scene of the crime, when they are allowed to have special access to when they make a statement, etc. So all the things that happen, that the public say, well, if that was me, that wouldn't be happening. And maybe there are good reasons for it. And what I struggle with most is explaining the practicality of to police departments. That even though there may be a great reason, that most folks just look at it in plain black and white. This seems unfair. It doesn't pass the sniff test, and therefore they need to start thinking a lot of crimes in those ways. And also, as I mentioned, explaining that criticism isn't an attack, right? It can be truthful and can be useful. And so what I often do is suggest to them, or suggest to all folks that are enamored by the police, and the citizens this way as well, that public service exists on many levels. I come from a family of teachers. I'm a social worker by trade, and it's okay to talk about child welfare and social workers as how badly they screwed up when a death is caused on their case. It is perfectly okay in this country to talk about teachers and the failures that they might have in school-to-prison pipeline issues. And these are public servants that are working every day to make our society better. It needs to be okay to have the same critique around police officers who are public servants, who I admit are working very difficult jobs to make the country better, the cities they're working better. We just need to be able to talk about it honestly. And so trying to make those points and having those conversations with the police is definitely one of my purposes. In addition to that, one of the things that's important to me, and that's kind of been an underlying theme of this conversation, is highlighting and having them accept the role of race and racism in their work. And that isn't to suggest that the department is full of card-carrying KKK members. That's not the suggestion. The suggestion is that all of us, the racism exists in the air we breathe and around all of us, and therefore the police are not immune to it. And that the numbers that are discussed highlight that it's possible that it may be worse within their practice. And just accepting that, and it kind of highlights for me, my favorite recommendation, and all of the recommendations that exist in the President's Task Force 21st Century Policing, is that departments acknowledge their historical wrongs. That they say, yeah, we did a lot of bad stuff. I think about Obama when he said, yeah, we tortured some folks. Remember that? And people kind of said that was kind of glib, and why did he say it that way? And it was because I believe, and I haven't talking to him yet, hopefully one day I will, that he was just trying to practice what he preaches. We did something that wasn't okay. We're trying every day to make it better. But there's no excusing, and we don't have a time machine, so we can't undo it, but we can acknowledge it and try and make it better. And I get frustrated when that can't be introduced into the conversation. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. So I'll also speak to just kind of more practical issues of the PAC. funding is an issue. I think every director of every department in this city is going to ask for more cash. So that's not so unusual, but we are especially in need of getting more access to resources. That means staff, that means extra funding.
Brian, he's talking to you.
He's already talked to us.
Right, and like I said, it's I think I appreciate the singularity of my vision, of my mission, I should say, because I have to work with the PAC, right? I don't have to worry about balancing the city's budget or anything else that goes on, and I'm fortunate not to have to worry about these things. I want to make sure that we get what we need, so we do the job that we do, which is why I speak as much as I can about what I would do with those dollars. And so overall, what that would be is a focus on policy, practice, and customs. And I'm probably taking too long here, so I'll just quickly go over what those mean. Policy, I think, is fairly simple, right? What is written down in the policy, what exists, how it should look differently, if it should look different, and how I would tailor it if I were in charge, right? The practice is really the implementation of those policies. How is it happening in real time? How is an officer doing their job as directed by policy? And the custom, to me, is probably the most difficult part of my job, but also the most important. Stuff that's never written down. How does one officer tell another officer how to do their job? How does one officer, what is the social emotional learning of officers? So forgive me, I'm a social worker. So that just basically means you learn a lot by what you see, right? Social emotional learning, right? Your dad can tell you never curse at somebody, but if he curses every single person that he meets, you're gonna learn to curse because he does it, regardless of the fact he told you never to do it. So I think officers are the same way. So what are the social emotional learning issues that are going on there? And for me, that involves a lot of granular individual conversations that need to happen. So resources would be devoted to that. Yeah. So those are kind of the overarching mission of the PAC. And as it relates to police shootings, we want to look at police shootings with a focus on policy, practice, and customs, and understand was the policy flawed, was the practice flawed, or was there a custom issue there, or is there a combination thereof? And try and make recommendations to our leaders that can suggest change on those levels.
Thank you. So we're gonna have questions in about 10 minutes. So I have a couple more questions, if I can squeeze them in. So DA Krasner, you've been publicly opposed by unions and your critics, the police union, and some of your critics have said that you are going to ruin the office, that Philadelphia is going to become the wild, wild west. Now, obviously, I don't think you agree with that, but my question is, as an African American, how do you balance the fact that the role of the office, of the district attorney's office, which is to prosecute people, how do you balance meeting the needs of African Americans who may be disproportionately victims of violent crimes in Philadelphia, but also perpetrators of violent crime? And how do you balance that need of being fair and providing justice to all defendants of color, but also meet the needs of victims of color?
Great question. I don't really think these are either or propositions. I don't think it's a choice between one and another. And I'm not suggesting you think that, but I'm just saying that there has been a tactic which has been used by conservatives for a very long time to say you can have your safety or you can have your justice. You can have your safety or you can have your Bill of Rights. You can protect victims or you can do justice. Well, I think that that's not how this works. I think that to the extent that you're able to enhance justice, that enhances safety. And just one small example of that is the science that we know around illegal stop and frisk. The fact is, it doesn't really do any good. And that's not just my opinion. Those are the stats on how infrequently a gun is found, 1 in 400 times, how infrequently any contraband is found, 1 out of 50 times. Look at New York, where they just took down illegal stop and frisk in the federal courts and homicides are going lower. That's the science. That is the science. So, there is an impact to doing things that smell like justice. Part of the impact is things like African American members of juries may be more likely to convict when they think that law enforcement is fair. It's things like young people who have been alienated from police in their neighborhoods by virtue of tactics that frankly a lot of police officers don't want to do anyway, such as illegal stop and frisk. They're not alienated anymore. They actually are willing to engage in some level of community policing and talk to police officers who are on the street and engage them at PAL, at the rec center, and sometimes they're willing to exchange information or be mentored or become police officers themselves. I mean, in Philly right now, we are actually dealing with a police department where we have declining numbers of African American officers coming out of academy, and where we have increasing numbers of officers from New York and New Jersey coming down here for 2 years. And no, they're not generally, other than white, okay? They're not generally of color. They're coming down here so they can work in an unfamiliar environment for 2 years and then go back to much more lucrative suburban gigs in New Jersey and New York. That's what's happening here. And that's going to keep happening as long as you have injustice in those neighborhoods.
Well, and to be fair, Blair, I do need to correct that. We've just graduated our most diverse class from the police academy ever. Our department is perfect, nor am I saying it's as diverse as it should be. But we are taking strides and we are making every effort to make sure that our department looks like our city. And so I do actually want to make sure that the record is clear that what you are saying was absolutely happening up until Commissioner Ross changed policy last year. Education requirements.
Well, I certainly hope that's correct.
The education
I can tell you that Rochelle Lawal, who's the head of the Guardian, said something different to me recently, and perhaps she was talking about the prior class. And I have no doubt that the commissioner doesn't want this. And I have no doubt you don't want this. And hopefully we're on the right track there. But there has been a history of that happening for a while. There have been declining numbers for the Guardians while we had increasing numbers of white officers. And if you have ever been to the FOP Hall, which is the one that's actually in Bucks County, sort of, if you got the side door, it's Bucks County. If you go in front door, it's Philly. If you've ever been up there, a friend of mine describes what you see there as a blizzard. Let me just I mean, that's just so I am glad to hear that we're on a better path. I'm not trying to belittle at all what Mr. Abernathy is saying, but that's true that I'm thrilled. I can't think of any better news than that.
You know, sometimes I struggle with the idea that, and I'm a proponent of a more diverse police force. Struggle with the idea that when we talk about racism, that it's just a color issue. So we infuse more color and then things are going to be all right. I think we need a lot more than that. And so I mean, again, I applaud it. I think it's fantastic. But you know, there are conversations around this country where a black DA or a infusion of black officers didn't change how oppressive the system was to people of color. So that's my own concern.
Well, I think that's a good point, that you're talking about institutional, entrenched, cultural norms.
And I don't think, there's no one here that would disagree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, and that's exactly why we've made some of the policy changes that we've had and that we've done. Whether that is making sure that we're not discharging at moving vehicles, making sure putting a higher burden on the officer on whether they can or cannot discharge their weapon. Those policies were put in place for a reason, was because there is a recognition that what was happening in Philadelphia was wrong. We voluntarily asked the Department of Justice to come in. We didn't have a consent decree from like Baltimore or Ferguson did. We wanted that research done here because we knew we were wrong. That training in this department has changed dramatically. Reality-based training has, I believe, changed our numbers greatly. That's been instituted under this administration. The officer involved shooting review team was instituted under this administration. That's not to say any of us are perfect. The department still has a long way to go. But there is a commitment from this administration to get there and work with the district attorney. I actually think we are mostly violent agreement.
I agree with that agreement.
Pretty violently agree. Okay, so we're at the last few minutes before we open it up to questions. And so second. So I would like to leave us kind of on a high note, or at least thinking about the future. So Brian, you've been a very good sport about some of the criticism. Can you talk to us a little bit, and can each of you kind of like in 1 minute tell you what the future looks like? How do we make this issue better, and how do we make Philadelphia a leader and reform like in an institutional way? If everyone's agreeing that this has not worked previously, what are you guys going to do to work together to make this a reality so people, regardless of what community and zip code they live in, regardless of their race, feel like they're being served with justice in the system?
I strongly believe that, yes, prosecutions of bad officers need to happen, but I actually think we need to do much more before that. We need to continue to improve our training. We need to continue to improve continued training for our officers. While we have taken dramatic strides, we still have more strides to take. I think we are very open to understanding exactly what is individuals' response or interactions with police officers, understanding those responses and then incorporating them into our policy and practice. Those are things that quite frankly, I think that's why the PAC was created the way it was to help us inform us. And I think the district attorney is going to be an incredible partner, not just on this issue of how the police interacts with the community, but also on our social, our justice and safety challenges that we have done to get the lowest prison population since the 1990s. We have a long, again, we're not there yet. We're below 6,400. But we still have, but we are committed to it, and I think working with our partners, we can continue to do that.
Well, first of all, I agree with all of that. The prison population is down 20.7% on its way to a goal of 33% reduction. It's very exciting. But I would just supplement everything that Mr. Abernathy says, with which I agree, by saying there's also got to be accountability. Body cameras are a good thing. Civilian cell phones raised and on are a good thing. And ultimately, if the DA's office is going to continue to turn a blind eye to the reality that the process is not fair, and to the reality that for political reasons, many of my predecessors ran away from prosecuting officers when the facts and the law led them to a truthful and accurate conclusion that a crime was committed, we're going to keep backing away. There's never going to be any accountability. I mean, I do understand that the job of a police officer is frightening, is dangerous, is hard on the system, is difficult. Decisions are made in an instant, and so does the law. The law recognizes all of that as being a reason not to file charges, but you might otherwise file charges as civilians. All of that is recognized and is accepted and will be part of the analysis we follow. But when the facts and the law, which does give this consideration, as it should, to the position of law enforcement, say you committed a crime, we're going to have to hold you accountable. That is the only way that you're going to have a culture of police officers being as careful as they can with the lives of others, like they should be, with their own lives.
Hans, do we get the final word before we start taking the questions?
So thank you. I think that overall, my impression is that we are slowly getting over an addition to a punitive response to everything. And so what frustrates me and what I'm concerned about is when I'm speaking to people who understand that contact with the police when it's their son or their uncle is unfair and that they wish they had been different, but or want to call progressive policy around safe injection sites the wrong course, and that what we need is more incarceration for those folks, right? And so what I am hopeful for is that we could have support for any policies that exist that don't call for the police to be the answer, to lock folks up, to use their handcuffs, or use their punitive responses. And so I think what we need is our community members to understand that. I understand it's especially difficult when something happens in your backyard, but we can't make policy based off a visceral reaction like that. So I ask for folks to really consider the macro level issues when they are, calling for law and order, calling for justice in those ways. And more selfishly, I ask for people to engage the PAC. If you are uncomfortable and unhappy with your interaction with the police, let me know or let us know. It's PAC at Phila.gov is the way to contact us. And we can talk about what exactly happened, and the more information we have, I unfortunately can't promise everybody that I'll give them a resolution for their case. But I think the more information we have is the more that we can identify trends, the more that we can identify policy issues that need to exist. It's a much lighter lift for us when people come to us about their issues that we can explore further.
Great, thank you. Oh, wow. Okay,